For today's talk, we are honored to have with us a very well-known scholar, Professor Farish Noor, who actually requires no introduction. He's going to speak to us on the topic of violent white men and heroic Asian women, the American attack on Sumatra in 1832, and the themes of race and gender during the rise of American power in Asia. This is a rather interesting, quite different topic from the ones that we would normally see, considering the fact that it touches on two areas that are quite out of the normal areas of concern, the activities of MBRAS. First is the focus on America instead of the usual British or Dutch or Portuguese. Number two is the fact that it is focusing on Sumatra in Indonesia. So instead of the British Malaya, Malaysia, and so on. But this is very much in line with MBRAS' expanded scope of coverage to include also Indonesia and southern Thailand. Now, today's topic is very special as the American attack on Sumatra, the very first time that the United States have intervened in Southeast Asia, and mainly in retaliation for plunder that was launched by a group of Malay pirates on the American merchantmen. And this was done in 1831. And the expedition by an American frigate sent by the president, it arrived in 1832. So in the battles that followed, we have seen some reports about how the American ship actually destroyed Kuala Batu. And, this Kuala Batu is actually in southwest of Aceh. So the attack raised some intense discussion in the United States, principally on the question of Sumatran women being killed in the process. So Professor Farish Noor is going to bring us back in time to look at the events from the perspective of race and gender, including the Americans being surprised by the knowledge that the Southeast Asian women were relatively emancipated than the white American women at the time. Now, Professor Farish Noor is currently Professor of History at the University of Malaya, and having been away for many years in Germany and Singapore, principally in Nanyang Technological University, Professor Farish has recently joined the University of Malaya at the Department of History. Many of us are familiar with his work, and he is a most prolific writer and author. Just this year alone, he produced, I think, at least 2 books. I think, let me just read to you the title of these 2 books. First one, The Long Shadow of the 19th Century, Critical Essays on Colonial Orientalism in Southeast Asia, published by Matahari Books, Kuala Batu 2021. And the second one is a book edited by Professor Farish and Professor Peter Carey, entitled Racial Difference and the Colonial Wars of 19th Century Southeast Asia. This was published by the Amsterdam University Press 2021. So without further much ado, I will pass the time over to Professor Farish. Prof.
Thank you very much, Professor Danny, and thank you to the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society for this invitation. I'm somewhat surprised to see that you're all here on a Saturday afternoon. I thought I was the only one with no social life whatsoever. I propose to talk about an event that, as Danny noted, took place more than a century ago, and in particular, my approach, and Danny mentioned some of the works I've written over the last 10 years. I'm back in my original domain, which is Southeast Asian history, but I'm not a historian of events or processes or institutions per se, but rather my approach has always been one that focuses more on textual analysis and discourse analysis. So I'm not here to talk about the actual attack on Kuala Batu that took place in January 1832, because that's already been written about, and there's ample material that you can find everywhere in books and online about the event itself. But what interests what interests me about this event is the manner in which this event was eventually, transmitted, communicated to an American electorate back in the United States of America at the time, and how it then sparked off for about 2 years, quite a furious and intense debate back in the United States about the role of America and how the members of the American Armed Forces, the American Navy, had conducted themselves in this place called Kuala Batu of the north coast of Sumatra, that most Americans had never even heard of, and how this event then became very quickly politicized because it came at a time when America's president, Andrew Jackson, was seeking re-election back in the US. Now, of course, there's something timely about this discussion because we now live in a post-Trump era where we are talking about fake news and distortions and the power of media and communicative architecture, etc., etc. And in some ways, this event fits the bill. It fits the bill in the sense that an event that took place thousands of miles away from the United States was later instrumentalized, and I think the correct word here is instrumentalized. It was instrumentalized by different political factions back in the United States that were either for or against Andrew Jackson. And for me, what's interesting about the reaction to the Kuala Batu event is how it demonstrated a number of things, including the deep cleavages within American society, but also it tells us a lot about American knowledge of Southeast Asia at a time when America was slowly emerging as a new player on the international political landscape. So very quickly, I'll just divide this short presentation into two parts. In the first part, I'll talk about the event itself, what actually happened, what we know about the event, and then I really want to get into the nitty-gritty discussion about, the reaction to it, particularly the way in which it was developed further in two domains: the American media, newspapers, of course, this is all pre-Facebook, as we know, and secondly, in the American Society of Letters, the books that were written about this event. In particular, I'll be looking at two works by Jeremiah Reynolds, 1835, and also Francis Warrener, 1835. So let's start with the event itself. Danny has alluded to this. I think I need not go into too much details. Basically, at the turn of the 19th century, a new power has emerged in the North Atlantic, and this is the United States of America. The United States, of course, at that time was a small, collection of colonies that had come together with the intention of being part of that North Atlantic, trading community. But on the other hand, acutely aware of both its geography and its history, and wanting to be a Western power that was different from the other powers of all Europe, of continental Europe. And this we see very clearly, particularly among the early generation of America's leaders, from people like Washington, all the way to Quincy Adams, to Thomas Jefferson, who made it a point to emphasize again and again that the United States, as it comes to assume its role as a new independent sovereign federation of states, will try to chart its own course as a Western power that seeks friends and not enemies in the world. So you have everything from Washington's final address, telling his people, telling Americans that America must be something different. We were once colonies. We must never aspire to become an imperial power ourselves. We must never walk down the path of the, countries of all Europe, of Britain, of France, of Spain, of Portugal, of Holland, and we need to seek allies through trade and to present ourselves as a Western power that is different somehow from the rest of Europe. And you see this all the way up to Jefferson. And the changes are not simply discursive, they're even sartorial. Jefferson, I believe, was the one who introduced a kind of dress code for American ambassadors, telling America's ambassadors to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, that they should even dress differently and not look like European ambassadors who would be in their military uniforms with the ostrich feathers or goose feathers or what have you, not carry swords, but instead wear a simple coat and hat and a stick, and constantly seek alliances, trading alliances, because America has to be a trading power. Now, here's the first problem that America faces. As it enters, the global stage, at the beginning of the 19th century, this is a country that no longer has a navy. And it's one of the weirdest, quirks of history that after America's War of Independence, the Americans actually disband their continental navy. They don't have a navy. So this is a trading power that wants to trade with the world, but doesn't have the military means to defend and protect American commercial vessels abroad. For a brief period, for a few years, all America had was its so-called customs cutter service, which are basically tiny boats that are used to perform customs duties for merchant vessels coming to America. So American trade overseas, as Americans seek to trade not only with Europe, but also with South America, with Central America, with the West Indies, and further with Asia and with Africa, American ships were venturing abroad without protection. That's the first factor we need to bear in mind. Secondly, American trade was very vulnerable. The experience of the Barbary Wars, where American merchant vessels were being attacked and hijacked and robbed in the Mediterranean, made American commerce a very perilous enterprise. And this, of course, was crucial for America's survival. It had to be a merchant power. It had to be a commercial power, but American ships were being hijacked in the Mediterranean, and the American government had to pay tribute, basically ransom money, to get their ships back all the time. Thirdly, America, above all, wanted to break away from their dependency on European suppliers for the basic necessities required in American households, even simple things like sugar or salt and pepper. And this is where our story begins. The story begins with the so-called pepper rush, when an American merchant, Jonathan Carnes, manages to sail all the way to Southeast Asia, again, without the protection of any American warships, sails all the way to Southeast Asia and secures for himself an entire shipload of pepper from Sumatra. And when he returns to Salem, this cargo of pepper, in terms of its value and its profit, ended up being worth, a whopping 7 times the original capital outlay put out by the investors. And this simply made Salem one of the most important and one of the richest cities of America at the time, because for the first time, Americans now didn't have to buy their pepper from the British or the Dutch or the Spanish or the Portuguese. They could get it themselves. Americans found a way to get to Sumatra on their own, to go and get the pepper for themselves. And Salem became the main distributor of pepper across the United States. This sparked what I call the pepper rush, where suddenly all these commercial companies, all these independent merchant vessels were now beginning to go to Sumatra to look for pepper. The story gets even more confusing 3 years later, when in 1831, as Danny pointed out earlier, an American commercial vessel, the Friendship, unfortunately named, the Friendship was actually hijacked by some people off Kuala Batu, which is a settlement along the northern coast of Sumatra. And this caused a major uproar among American investors and business people, especially the pepper merchants of Salem, who had very strong political connections with the respective parties and political leaders. The company that owned the Friendship, included men who had contacts with Congress, and so very soon there was this clamoring for retribution. America has to stand up. We cannot allow our ships to trade in Asia, in China, in Japan, in Southeast Asia without protection. What is the American government doing, and what is President Jackson doing? So pressure is put on Jackson to do something. Now, this is the time when Andrew Jackson was the President of the United States and Levi Woodbury was the Secretary of State for Naval Affairs. And so it was decided then that an American frigate, the USS Potomac, would sail all the way to Sumatra to quote unquote teach the Sumatran Malays a lesson. And the whole point was that the mission, if we read Woodbury's commands that was sent to the commander of the vessel, Commodore Downs, the objective of the mission was manifold. One, try to get back what we lost. Two, find out who was behind this attack and bring them to justice. And three, impress upon the people of Kuala Batu that American merchant ships will not be attacked any longer, and that America will actually retaliate. Now, this is the sort of command, which can get any subordinate into trouble, because it's couched in terms that are so vague that it's not clear. Even when we read the entire dispatch from Woodbury to Downs, we're not sure what exactly Downs is supposed to do. But anyway, on his way there, Downs prepares the vessel for war. And what eventually happens is the attack on the settlement of the coastal settlement of Kuala Batu in early January 1832. And this, at that time, was quite an important event. It was so important that years later, 7 decades after that, in John Ellis's book, The History of Our Country, the United States, he dedicates part of the chapter on Andrew Jackson to this event. Now, from very different sources, and we're trying to triangulate here different accounts from those who were on the ship, those who were writing about the event, and news reports. What we know is that when the USS Potomac, and this is a heavy frigate, by the way, America in those days did not have what we call first raters. The American Navy was still very small, and the heaviest vessels they had were basically third-rate or second-rate frigates. These are nautical terms, by the way. So it's a 40-gun frigate designed to act independently, and it's not a ship of the line. Ships of the lines are first raters and second raters. Third raters are frigates and smaller vessels. But it's quite a heavily armed ship. And certainly at that time in Southeast Asian waters, as far as European vessels are concerned, this was a very powerful vessel. Now, the problem with this is that it later turns out, and this comes from, again, like I said, various sources, those on board, those who commanded the expedition, those who wrote about it afterwards, that some degree of subterfuge was used. Several sources have noted that as the USS Potomac approached Kuala Batu, it disguised itself. And it even flew the flags of another country. Some say Denmark, some say Sweden. It disguised its gun ports, so it appeared like a commercial vessel rather than a military ship. Because remember, this is a long journey. It takes a year it takes several months for the Potomac to actually reach Sumatra. And so they have enough time to refit the vessel. The attack takes place before dawn, when it's still dark. And what we know is that there were attempts at dialogue, but whether Downs had actually pursued, the line of questioning, actually interrogated the Sumatrans and asked them who exactly was responsible, these things are not clear. What becomes clear is that the attack took place before dawn because Kuala Batu was a coastal settlement consisting of a population of perhaps more than 2,000 people. And it had 5 fortresses facing the sea. These were wooden palisades. The attack took place while the inhabitants of Kuala Batu were still asleep. And Marines and blue jackets were landed on the beach while there was supporting fire from the frigate itself. And the end result, in a matter of a few hours, basically Kuala Batu is blasted to pieces. It's blasted to pieces, and the estimates of those killed range from around 200 to 500, including women and children. Now, the vessel after that, sails to Batavia, then, under the control of the Dutch, and makes its way back across the Pacific, all the way back to California. California, remember, then is still part of Mexico. Yes, not part of America. So it has to then sail all the way down Latin America, South America, and then sail up again the eastern coast until it gets all the way back to the United States. So it's a long journey. And during this time, those on board the vessel felt that they had done what they were asked to do. It was a punitive action, it was an act of reprisal, and it had been a demonstration of power in no uncertain terms. Several hundred Sumatran Malays had been killed, men and women and children, and there were only 2 casualties. More American sailors actually died of diarrhea on the journey than during the fighting itself. Now, what Commander Downes did not realize was that immediately after the event, news of the American attack on Kuala Batu had actually reached America much faster than the USS Potomac itself. And that's because of the enormous volume of commercial trade with fast commercial vessels, darting back and forth across the Pacific from China, Japan, Southeast Asia, back to America. And so in the months that, the Potomac took its time to get back to America, the news had already arrived in America, and it had been gobbled up by the American press. The American press at the time being deeply divided along 2 camps, those who were pro Andrew Jackson and those who were anti Andrew Jackson. Now, this is what I want to look at. I want to look at how the Kuala Batu event was later discussed, disseminated, digested by the American public, and it was a very divided public at the time. What basically happened in the course of those few months, while the Potomac was slowly making its journey back to America, was the news of the attack arrived in America and was immediately seized upon, particularly by those who were hostile to Andrew Jackson, and represented to the American public as an instance of American aggression against Southeast Asians, the Malays of Sumatra. And very soon, they developed this narrative, and then this narrative is part of the title of this talk, that this was a clash between violent white men and heroic Asian women, Southeast Asian women, because one theme that was seized upon by the American press was the killing of Southeast Asian women, Malay women in Sumatra. And the debate then, took on a life of its own back in the United States. And it's actually very interesting because some of these newspapers can be found on archives. You will find that all these different newspapers, they are all very, very partisan. And there is clearly a very imaginative play with facts and figures taking place on both sides. So those who were hostile to Jackson blamed Jackson and Levi Woodbury for initiating this attack on Sumatra, saying that this was an instance of barbarism and violence where, unarmed, poorly equipped Southeast Asian natives had been slaughtered, massacred by Americans, including Asian women. And how could, American men, Christian men, conduct themselves in such a manner that, in the name of protecting American, economic rights and economic freedom and what have you. On the other hand, there were other equally partisan newspapers that were also equally imaginative with their play with numbers and facts. Some, for instance, I believe one newspaper in Boston flatly outright said, no, not a single woman had been killed. Of course, none of these journalists were actually there, but, some of these newspapers said, no, this is absolutely not true. It could not possibly happen because it is not conceivable that an American man could kill a woman anywhere, much less an Asian woman in Southeast Asia. So obviously this could not happen. Some would dispute the figures. Some brought the figures down to maybe about 50 or 30 or 20. And one interesting thing, and I'll come back to this later on, some newspapers even opined that maybe one or two Malay women were actually killed, but you can't really blame our soldiers because actually they all look alike. And in Asia, you must understand that Asians actually look very similar to one another, and maybe our soldiers couldn't tell who was a man and who was a woman. Now, this is going to be a very important theme. I'll come back to this at the end. It's one of the 3 points I want to raise in my conclusion. So what you have then is this mediatic debate that takes place really at the level of newspapers and newspapers across the United States. Again, remember, we're talking about a much smaller United States. So these are papers from Boston, from Washington, and what have you. It involves, I know, papers like the National Intelligencer and papers like that. Compounding the debate even further was the absence of, quote unquote, better informed, detailed accounts of what happened. Now, here's where the whole Potomac saga becomes interesting, because in the course of this journey, there were also writers on board, or men who would later write. And 3 years after the event, I mean, as we all know, I think most of us are academics here, books don't get written in a week, right? So academics take longer. The academic response, or rather the scholarly, response in book form, comes out several years later with the publication of 2 books in particular, in 1835 by Jeremiah Reynolds, who's actually a very interesting figure in American literary history, because he is credited with, as being the person who eventually inspired the story of Moby Dick, Herman Melville's famous novel. And another writer who was actually serving on board the Potomac, Francis Warriner. In 1835, both Jeremiah Reynolds and Francis Warriner, who had been on that journey, Warriner had been on the journey from start to end. Reynolds comes on board halfway through when the Potomac was already making its way back to the US. They write their much bigger, larger, longer, detailed accounts of the Potomac's entire journey around the globe. And in both of these books, both published in 1835, an enormous amount of attention is paid to the Kuala Batu incident in particular. That's the highlight of both of these books. And it's interesting that these 2 authors likewise had 2 very different views. Warriner, being a somewhat godly man, a pious person, we can tell through his writings, writes a somewhat critical account of this. Even though, remember, Warriner was actually serving on the ship. He was actually on board the Potomac. He writes an account of the attack on Kuala Batu in terms that are somewhat disparaging, noting, to quote him, that the attack was carried out in a somewhat desultory manner and that there was looting involved. Warriner confesses, a certain degree of shame for having been part of the expedition and having witnessed, American troops, sailors, and Marines robbing and stealing while they were attacking Kuala Batu, including the theft of a Quran from the palace. Jeremiah Reynolds, on the other hand, is an interesting author because, on the one hand, he does concede that there was quite a lot of violence in the attack itself, noting that women were indeed killed in the fighting. Justifies it in a very interesting way on the grounds that America, as an emerging commercial power, has to have the martial means to defend its commercial shipping abroad, because without that, America cannot grow. So America had come to trade, and when you attack our merchant vessels, we will retaliate. We will have to retaliate. Now, he makes an interesting comparison with the situation back in the United States itself. Can I please ask Silva to mute your camera, because I can it's bothering me a bit. Yeah, thank you. So Reynolds does concede that there was violence taking place there, but at several points in his text, he makes a very interesting comparison, and I'll return to this also at the end, where he says that if we Americans are to be admonished for what we did at Kuala Batu in Sumatra, then how would we justify to ourselves what we are doing back in the United States in our dealings with the native aborigines of the American continent, namely the American Indians? Yeah? So he gives an example that when an American homestead is attacked by Native Americans, we send in the US cavalry and you basically exterminate them. And this is what we are doing abroad as well. So for Reynolds, the pivotal thing here is the protection of Americans. So whether an American is being attacked back in the United States or an American is being attacked in Asia, it makes no difference. You know, yes, there was violence, and yes, we were violent, but this was self-defense. So it's a very interesting debate that doesn't actually, you know, resolve the issue. And this issue remains on the back burner in American politics, despite the attempts by Jackson's opponents to play this up as an instance of Jacksonian ambition and Jackson's belligerent martial war-like ways. Remember, Jackson won the election precisely because he had been a general before that. He was hugely popular because of his Anglophobic tendencies and his role in the Anglo-American War. So it didn't really blunt his reputation. In fact, it made him a bit more popular with the Hawks back in the United States. So the net result is what happens after several years. The issue eventually dies down. Jackson wins the presidency. Levi Woodbury's reputation remains intact because he publishes all his, correspondence with the commander of the American vessel and said, look, you can see my orders. I didn't tell them to go and kill them, I mean, it's Downes' fault. So who takes the fall? Commander Downes takes the fall and eventually is demoted and is never given command of an American naval vessel ever again after that. He ends up being a commander of a dockyard and basically lives out the rest of his life on sort of EPF pension and basically never gets to command an important vessel. The American troops are never admonished for what happened. There's no inquiry, of course, at the time, and the issue more or less dies down until about 6 years later, when once again another American vessel is attacked, aggressed, again at the same place, around the vicinity of Kuala Batu and Mukek in Sumatra, and a second expedition is sent. And this second expedition, this is the 1838 expedition, where 2 ships are sent by the Americans, and they do the same thing. They basically blast the hell out of Kuala Batu, and they burn Mukek to the ground. However, in a space of just 6 years, American attitudes towards violence, about American power, about demonstrations of American power overseas had changed. So it's actually very interesting to see that by the end of the second American expedition, this is America's second act of aggression in Sumatra, in Southeast Asia in the 19th century, you don't have a similar response. You don't have this heated debate in the American press. People don't write books, admonishing the Americans for what they did. In fact, one of the books that I know of, that I actually have, was by Robert Fitch Taylor, who ironically was actually the chaplain of one of these American vessels, and it's very triumphalist, and it's triumphalist and vainglorious, and Fitch Taylor writes, that we have done the right thing. We've taught these people a lesson, and this is how piracy and barbarism will be met by our forces abroad. We will literally send. I mean, these are his words. We will send them to the afterlife. There's even a passage in his book where he talks about the bombing of Mukek, when Mukek's burned down through the use of incendiary bombs. And Fitch Taylor actually says it's a pity that the attack didn't take place at night, because it would have been a spectacular sight to behold, to watch this entire settlement burn to the ground. And so that's your attitudinal change. So I'm looking at this micro history. This is one event, the attack on Kuala Batu in 1832, the reaction by the American press and later by American writers that follows in 1832, 33, 34, all the way to 1835. It's a short period. It's a really micro history. But from this one micro event, I think there are a lot of things that we can learn. And this is really what I want to draw out of this, because like I said, you know, enough has been written about the Kuala Batu affair, and I won't be able to, I'm not adding much to it. I'm more interested in the reactions of the American press and the reactions of American writers, and what the writings in the community of American intellectuals and men of letters at the time saw or thought of this event and how they framed it in terms that are distinctly American. Now, there are three things I want to raise. The first is the incomprehension or the incredulity of the Americans when receiving women had actually taken part in the fighting in Kuala Batu. And this is where I want to share with you an image, one of the very few images that we have of this. And this is the famous painting by John Carter Beard. Can you see it? I hope you can see it. Simply entitled Kuala Batu. Now, this painting, of course, was done much, much later. It is a painting, but it was reproduced as a monochrome facsimile by the end of the century in 1898 in John Ellis's book, The History of Our Country, the United States. And this is one of the most striking images that we get in the chapter on Andrew Jackson. And dramatic though it looks, it does actually sum up many of the observations that were made by eyewitnesses then, namely that women were involved. And this is actually an almost accurate depiction of what actually happened, because there are several accounts that point to an incident where one of the women actually fought off an American soldier in hand-to-hand, combat, and actually injured the American soldier, cutting off his thumb. These are one of the few casualties that we have. So this image, ends up, it's painted by John Carter Beard, and I don't know where the original is. I've never seen it in original color, but this image, in so many ways, sums up, how the event was seen, that this was a case of American soldiers and Marines attacking a settlement where men and women were there, and women were actually involved in the fighting, in the defense of Kuala Batu itself. Now, this struck Americans as being highly peculiar because the idea of women being involved in fighting, of course, is something very strange and new to Americans at the time. Again, we have to remember, this is happening at a very interesting time. America is encountering Southeast Asia as an independent country, as an independent America, perhaps for the first time. Prior to that, there was some trade between the United States when it was a set of colonies with Southeast Asia, but these were done under the auspices of the British Empire. So now Americans for the first time are coming to Southeast Asia. And what do Americans know about Southeast Asia? Well, actually not much. Simple as that. So the works of people like Warriner and Reynolds were in fact the first attempts by Americans to write an American account of Southeast Asia seen from American perspective. So this is important. Why is this important? It's important because the works of people like Reynolds and Warriner become to the Americans, the John Marstons. They are John Marstons. It's the beginning of American scholarship on Southeast Asia written by Americans for Americans. That's the first observation I want to make. The two other observations I think are more important, which is the manner in which the American press in particular at the beginning, presented and represented this event for the benefit of an American readership, an American audience. Remember, these are American newspapers, yeah, read by Americans, produced by Americans for an American readership. So these American newspapers are presenting this event in a manner that is actually very divisive, as I've said. Now, there is an evident outpouring of sympathy, an enormous amount of sympathy from some, not all, some of the American newspapers for women, Southeast Asian women, who are then cast in these heroic terms. Hence, again, the title of this talk, violent white men and heroic Southeast Asian women. I mean, this is how it's framed. A very neat, easy, simple dialectics emerges in these, newspaper columns and op-eds and opinion pieces written at the time. And how could, so American masculinity is being questioned here. How could men, American men, kill these Asian women? And at the same time, aren't these Asian women incredibly heroic and brave, and aren't they fantastic? Because they can fight. They can actually fight. They fight back. They defend their homeland. And we have these accounts of them actually grabbing at the rifles of the American soldiers, and that's what you see in the painting earlier by Carter Beard, where this mysterious, this unknown, unnamed Sumatran woman actually grabs at the bayonet of the American Marine going for the kill, and eventually, that same woman actually fights back and nearly cuts off the thumb of that same soldier. Now, what I find interesting about this juxtapositioning is that it brings together, two themes at the same time: gender and race. You have, in a rare moment of perhaps, self-critique and introspection, questions about, white masculinity. It's long before, Trump and MTV and Netflix political correctness. You already have this actually happening a century ago in the debates, that come up. When we read the press reports, the critics of this event were raising serious questions about, what is it to be an American, especially an American soldier abroad, if this is what you do, if this is what you actually do. But again, note the point I made earlier about the absence of knowledge of Southeast Asia. And these are Americans who are encountering Southeast Asia for the first time with little knowledge of the societal norms, the socio-political, socio-economic norms and praxis that existed already in many parts of Southeast Asia, particularly maritime Southeast Asia. This, of course, takes place in Kuala Batu, which was a small polity at times, in its history, a vassal of Aceh. And if you know the history of Northern Sumatra, then you would know that, women have been very prominent in politics and even in military affairs. That the Kingdom of Aceh, for instance, had 4 successive queens in a row, and is known, of course, for its famous Laksamana Kumalahayati, who was at one point the commander of the Royal Navy of the Kingdom of Aceh. Those who know the history of the Malay Peninsula would know also of the famous queens of several Malay kingdoms, and anyone who's been to maritime Southeast Asia, who have done have lived in Southeast Asia at the time and engaged in trade in Southeast Asia at the time, would be aware of the fact that women were very prominently featured and present, especially in domestic commerce. In commerce, in merchants, in markets, you see a daily routine, normalized presence of women there. These are all new things for an American readership, an American public back in the United States that were perhaps not familiar with this. So that's one thing. It tells us something about America's lack of knowledge of Southeast Asia at the time. Equally interesting is how the American press, again, a very partisan press, was inclined to take up the plight of the Sumatran woman, the Malay woman, and present her as a kind of heroic victim of American aggression, abroad, at a time when there was already excessive violence being meted out to Native American women back in the United States itself. So here is a case of, really selective sympathy at work, right? Oh, remember, the ones who really took up, the cudgel, the ones who really took up the cause of the Sumatran as victims were those who were clearly in the anti-Jackson camp at the time. So this is, again, like I said, a case of political instrumentalization of an event that took place hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away. So those who wanted to criticize Jackson and Levi Woodbury and the US Navy were more than inclined to actually pick up this point about, how could we, America, an upright, moral Christian nation, do this to the Southeast Asians and to Southeast Asian women in particular, who were brave and heroic, and we are the aggressors. But back home in the United States at the same time, you have, the massive, relocation and relocation, the forceful relocation of literally hundreds of thousands of Native Americans by the same president. Andrew Jackson, of course, on record, is the American president who is responsible for perhaps the biggest movements of Native Americans in the North American continent. And that aroused no controversy among Americans at the time. So here was a case where you really have, selective sympathy at work. So that's why I find this incident very interesting. People today, when we talk about fake news and media distortions and all that, we talk about, the manipulation and the instrumentalization of public outrage and public sympathy. Well, here you have it happening literally 100 years ago, and it's all there. And you can actually still find these newspapers and read them. And it's really interesting to see how these sentiments jump off the page and they resonate with us today. The third point I want to raise is this, coming from the first two. One, America's relative ignorance of Asia and Africa at the time and the beginnings of American scholarship in the broader sense, not simply books like the ones by Wariner and Reynolds, but also in the American press. Moving on to the second point about the selective instrumentalization or utilization of sentiment in the way in which this event was then represented to a divided American readership, a divided American audience back there. Then you move to the third point, which is, I think, very telling again of the historicity of this event and what makes this a very 19th century event. Now, earlier I alluded to the defense that had been raised by several of those who wanted to defend the conduct of American soldiers in Sumatra. And this comes out in some of the newspaper reports, and this also comes out in the writings of Jeremiah Reynolds in particular. And this is the idea that, yes, maybe some Malay women were killed, but you can't blame our soldiers because actually they all look alike. In Southeast Asia, in Asia, men and women look alike. Now, this is a very old idea. And this is an idea that has intimate links to what would later be referred to as scientific racism. Because this is where gender and race come together and they meet on the level of biology and physiology. The idea that Southeast Asians, look alike, that Southeast Asian men and Southeast Asian women actually look alike or resemble one another, is not unique to this event. Those of you who are familiar, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Raffles' History of Java, published decades earlier, 1817, will see that Raffles says the same thing when he talks about the Javanese. Raffles talks about the Javanese, and one of the things he notes is the relative hairlessness of Javanese men. The fact that they do not have thick mustaches or beards. He talks about the sparsity of facial hair and bodily hair on the men and notes how similar they are. This is a theme that goes all the way back to the beginnings of the 19th century, and it continues all the way to the end of the 19th century, from Raffles in 1817 to the writings around the Kuala Batu incident in the 1830s, all the way up to Albert Bickmore's, Travels Across the East Indian Archipelago, published in 1869, along the same time as Wallace's, the Malay Archipelago. Bickmore makes exactly the same observation. He says that, when you're in Southeast Asia, you note that, men and women, males and females actually look alike because the men do not have facial hair. The men are not as hairy as we white Europeans are. And there is a similarity. It's hard to tell the difference. Bickmore makes these observations again and again. When he's in Ambon, when he's in the Moluccas, when he's in Java, when he's in Sumatra, he makes this observation. They look alike, they look alike, they look alike. Now, this is not your conventional racist trope, or all Asians look alike. Yeah, this is not that. This is something actually far more complex and a bit deeper, and it's a bit more important. The logic behind this is a pseudoscientific one, and it's couched really in the vocabulary of pseudosciences and scientific racism. And the idea is simple and complex at the same time. The idea is simply this. As the American school of scientific racism evolves, from the late 18th all the way throughout the 19th century, through people like Louis Agassiz, who was the teacher of Albert Bickmore, the theory of racial hierarchies emerge, and the theory of racial hierarchies is coupled by the theory of polygenesis, namely that the human race is not one species, but rather several species. So Asiatics are one species, Africans are one species, and white Europeans are another species. So that's polygenesis. With polygenesis, then also comes the violent racial hierarchies of, which species is above, which subspecies is below. So Europeans were then seen and cast as the most superior, the most advanced. Why? Because it is the level of advancement, the evolutionary advancement of the species, that leads to this very clear distinction between male and female, right? In the same way that, the same pseudoscience that was used to come up with these theories of racial difference were also applied to the natural environment, natural world, where you see where a similar argument was being deployed. I.e., if you look at lesser species, you can't tell the difference between male and female. So, whether they are clams or prawns or crabs or whatever, they all look alike. But in the higher species, a higher species like lions, you can tell a lion from a lioness because this is a higher evolved animal, so the males look like males and the females look like females. So likewise with human beings, when you have different communities, different races, and if you entertain the false idea that we are not one race but rather several races, then you can see actually in some of the quote-unquote lesser races or inferior races, you can't actually tell the difference between the men and women. They all look alike. But in the higher races, because there's been more evolution, then you actually see very clearly, in the same way that among lions and lionesses, you can see a clear distinction. Likewise, among Europeans, you can see a clear distinction because men have beards and bodily hair and women don't, and of course, this is, again, like I said, it's historical, it's timely, it's really located in that era. It's a very 19th century idea that dovetails and fits right into that logic of a kind of Victorian conservative sexuality that emerges later on, with very clear notions of what men should look like and what women should look like, and how there should not be a mixing of the two. In instances where you do have this blurring of identities, where in certain societies where men and women look more similar than different, then that is seen as an indicator of a lack of evolutionary development. So this theme that pops up in both the newspaper reports and the writings that come out at that time are not coincidental. They're not coincidental, they're not accidental, They're part and parcel of a bigger intellectual leitmotif in the background, where these theories are already in circulation in the popular public domain, in the society of letters, among intellectuals, among policymakers, but it's widely accepted as being more or less the truth. Incidentally, this distinction, or rather the absence of distinction, the idea that Southeast Asians look alike, was also applied to Native Americans. commonly, when you read a lot of American writings of the 18th and 19th century, you get the same thing coming up again and again and again. Native Americans look alike. You don't know who's the man, who's the woman. They look alike. They all have long hair. They don't have beards. And, so why have they not evolved like us? Why can't they be as distinctly different the way we are? So that's again seen as evidence of a lesser state of evolution. So in summing up, I think when we look at the Kuala Batu event, there are many ways we can write about it. One can write a simple conventional history of what happened, who killed what, when, and why, and how many bullets were shot, how many people were killed, or what have you, and the jury is still out. We still have conflicting accounts of how many exactly were killed during this time. But at the same time, we also have some facts that I think through triangulation are more or less reliable. We know how and why and when the attack happened. We know the chain of command. We know the orders. We have access to these documents that tell us exactly who was involved, when did the attack take place, what sort of material was used, where cannons were landed on the beach and all that. This we have, right? What is interesting here is that in a sort of Simon Sharma-esque way, we have bare facts. We have the bare facts that actually tell us, what were the exact circumstances of the event that took place. But what I find more interesting is interpreting the interpretations of these facts, which is really what concerns me, what I do in my own work, which is attempting a kind of interpretation of interpretations, and how in the course of interpreting the American interpretation of this event, the attack on Kuala Batu, we learn a lot, not only about Kuala Batu, but crucially, we learn a lot about America. We learn a lot about American perceptions of itself and themselves vis-a-vis the non-Western world, the non-white, non-Christian world. We learn a lot about American attitudes towards violence, and when and where and why violence was deemed necessary and justifiable in some cases and not. We learn a lot about the divided nature of American politics and American society at the time. We also learn about America's level of knowledge or information about Southeast Asia, which was not a lot, but actually, is actually interesting because it's a very American understanding of what Southeast Asia is. We learn a lot about American attitudes towards Southeast Asians, but we don't learn much about Southeast Asians themselves. So in a sense, this is really a discussion about how Southeast Asia comes to figure into the popular imaginary of the Americans, and how this small event, and it is really micro history, would later on, be played up and be animated and have gain a life of its own back in the context of America. As a result of the pepper boom that I mentioned earlier, the crest of Salem until today, I believe, still has the image of, a Malay on it, so it's like a shield with, I think, a quote-unquote Malay pirate on one side of it. So these are the traces of America's early encounters with Southeast Asia, which I think have largely been regarded as less important compared to, of course, America's larger presence and longer standing presence in the Philippines. It's important for us to remember that, 7 decades before America even, entertained the idea of acquiring the Philippines as its political and commercial and military naval base in Southeast Asia, America had already attempted to do the same thing in Southeast Asia today. And I think this is important for us as well in terms of how we today, we are looking at the state of Southeast Asia today, where we see again a renewed presence of the United States in our part of the world. And of course, when America comes to Southeast Asia now, it's, I think, patently obvious for all of us to see that this is part and parcel of a contestation between America and China. The vocabulary that is used today, freedom of navigation, freedom of trade, freedom of movement, these are not new. These are exactly the same words used 100 years ago. And that's why, again, as a historian, one of the banes of being a historian is that, there's nothing new in your life. You end up feeling that there's almost, when do we ever encounter originality? And I unfortunately have rarely come across originality, because I keep seeing, I keep hearing, and I keep reading, these narratives popping up again and again and again in our immediate present. So though it is, like I said, a small event, it is a small event, it is a small event, it is microhistory. I think this is an instance where microhistory can be mined in a manner that is productive, and I think perhaps useful, and a manner that might inform our understandings of the world we live in today. So I leave it at that, and I'll pass it back to you, Danny. I believe you're moderating.
Yes, thank you, Farish. Thank you so much for this very illuminating way of looking at history, interpreting interpretations. We have listened to Prof. Farish Noor, from a very micro event that took place in Kuala Batu in 1832. He has actually brought us to take a look at how the Americans first started to venture out to understand, to try to understand, or at least made an attempt to understand Southeast Asia, and through the many debates that actually happened because of the event. But at the same time, we also realized that the event that took place actually, Prof. Farish actually brought us to talk about a question about race, theory of race that were emerging in the 19th century. And if one were to look at how writings were being done at that point of time on various punitive actions and so on, one could actually find a lot of similar terms being used, or phrases being used in those documents as well. So I'll just leave it here, and I think some of you may have some questions, inquiries, or maybe you want to have some comments that you want to make for
North America after the war.
Yeah. So what we are going to do is you can raise your hand, or if you want to actually write something on the chat box, I can actually moderate the questions so that we can actually ask Prof. Farish to echo them. Yeah, please. If you can just raise your hand.
I think Hyung Hong has a.
Dr. Paul Hyung Hong.
Hi, thank you, Prof. Danny, and thank you, Prof. Farish, for a really, really fascinating and very animated kind of history. Yeah? And I like it that you related to that event, that microhistory, to a lot of present themes that we have in the academia. And I'm just wondering, because you talk about how to triangulate different sources to construct the perspective, different perspective, right? I'm just wondering whether you can also talk a little bit more about as a historian, how would you reconstruct native view from colonial record or from European record? Is it possible? And or perhaps you can give us some example to explain how can we do that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The simple answer is I don't know, and because this is, of course, the enormous challenge that we face. Now, of course, I saw Peter Carey is with us here. Now, Peter's work on the British invasion of Java, draws a lot on Javanese sources. And thankfully, this is one of the hugely important things about the British intervention in Java from 1811 to 1816, is that there were Javanese records. The Javanese wrote about it. The Javanese, and that's hugely important for historians to read and to mine, for us to do this, triangulation and reconstruction. Now, unfortunately, in the case of Kuala Batu, I do not know of any myself. I've never come across it. What I have managed to find are actually newspapers, both online and in hard copy format, newspaper reports. And that's where I tried to do the triangulation by looking at how different American newspapers and different American authors attempted to present and represent this, because they have clearly divergent and different and even conflicting views about it. But sadly, on this one event, I've not been able to find anything. I wish I could, but I've not been able to find, in terms of local sources, none so far. That doesn't mean that it's not there. Yeah, it doesn't mean it's not there. I mean, there's still a possibility of that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other questions? Yes, Catherine. Catherine.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your talk. I just heard about it an hour before it started, and I wish my colleagues could have attended it too, because there's so many people who are interested in the violence surrounding decolonialization here in the Netherlands. And I just want to follow up on the question that Poor asked. Have you been able to do any field work in Sumatra, or have you been able to encounter oral historical sources? Area.
Yeah, fieldwork, yes, but oral sources, no. Again, because of this, I mean, years ago, I was actually doing a documentary project in Aceh, and when I was there, I managed to actually do a very quick trip to the site of Kuala Batu and Mukek, where there are no monuments or whatever. It's not even in the history books. Yeah, local people, of course, know it, but it's passed down from generation to generation. Of course, this is something that happened more than a century ago. We don't have any survivors. So in that sense, no, I've not been able to get stuff. What I have managed to do, however, is actually lay my hands on the actual American newspapers. I'm talking about hard copies. Yeah, and that's another kind of field work, because I'm a nerd and I have no social life, I have no friends, and so what I do is on the weekends I go to flea markets. And over the years when I lived in Europe, what I used to do was basically spend 4 days a week going to flea markets to basically buy old newspapers by the kilo. And so all this material that I've been using over the last 10 years was actually accumulated 30 years ago, right? And where I bought these newspapers, and I would actually go through them and look with a magnifying glass, look for words like Sumatra, Java, Borneo, or whatever, and that I've been able to find. So ironically, the actual hard copy American newspapers that I used for my book and for the paper that I wrote were actually found in London. Of all places. But within Southeast Asia itself, I think this is a problem that many historians face. It's actually very hard for us to find these sources. Another thing that I've not done, and this is because of my own personal limitation, right? I'm not fluent in Dutch. Like I said, immediately after the Potomac bombarded Kuala Batu, it then sailed off to Batavia. And so there must have been records, because I know the Dutch very scrupulously kept records of all ships that arrived in Batavia, when they arrived, when they left. And of course, the Potomac was not a merchant ship. It was an army vessel. It was an American warship. So this, if anyone has any records of this, I would be very, very, very grateful, because I know from the second American expedition, when Samuel Fitch Taylor wrote about it, likewise, their ships also stopped at Batavia. They did meet with American merchants who were based in Batavia at the time. They did pay a visit to the consulate or whatever representation there was there. So they are American records, but I would be very interested in Dutch records. Unfortunately, I confess beforehand, I have no command at all of Dutch, so this is my biggest limitation.
The Dutch newspapers have been digitized, even the Dutch language newspapers from Indonesia as well. And they're on the website of the Royal Library. I will send you a link.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Before we let Sultan Farish and also Sain to ask their question, perhaps we call upon Professor Peter Carey to say a few words about the Javanese women fighters.
Hello, Peter.
Hi there. Thanks for your lovely talk. Inspiring on a wet afternoon in Jakarta.
Right.
Yeah.
Hope you're
Very
well.
nice. Yeah, thank you. Three quick things. I mean, I think that you would find it very useful to look at the delpha.nl, yeah, a website, because that has 15 million pages of Dutch newspapers. It has all the colonial newspapers, the Javas Courant, and that has an incoming, it always reports what ships are
Exactly.
actually at anchor in Batavia, which ships are leaving Batavia, which ships are coming in.
Yep.
And something like the Potomac, with its captain, would have been noted in the Javas Courant. Yeah. So actually you can have, I mean, I actually wrote a little article about the corvette which took Diponegoro into exile in Sulawesi, and all that information was based on these newspapers. I could actually plot the course of that ship throughout its 14 years of existence, between 24 and 38.
Although having said that, Peter, we know exactly where the Potomac was because Reynolds was very scrupulous, especially in his appendices. You know, so we know exactly where it was on what day. We even know, which crew members began to die of dysentery on board and all that. That we have. It's I suppose what you're talking about is very similar to the bulletin in Singapore that also records ships coming in and leaving. What I'm interested in is, I mean, presumably it wasn't a transit visit. They must have stopped, gone down, resupplied. And like I said, the news of the attack reached America long before the Potomac. It was probably brought by commercial vessels. So my question is, I'm more interested in Dutch newspaper reports then, that might have said, oh, by the way, last week, this American ship just bombed Kuala Batu, blah, blah, blah. And I wonder how the Dutch would have presented it in a Dutch press. So that's really what I'm still looking for. But again, I confess, my problem is I need a translator to help me with this.
Okay, well, I'll do a quick search for you. Obviously, actually, is outside the realm of Dutch sort of formal power at this time.
Yeah, exactly.
Certainly, I mean, the Penang Gazette and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, the second thing is, obviously, there's a very rich martial tradition in Java of women fighters. Yeah? I mean, when the Sultan, he has a private bodyguard. I mean, the rulers of southern Java, Solo and Jogja, and before them Mataram, had a personal bodyguard, and they were made up entirely of women. So after the Maghrib prayers, not a single male was actually in the inner court area. It was guarded by females. And the only British officer to die in the British attack on Jogja was killed by a female soldier. Yeah. He took 5 days to die. He was a lieutenant in the Buckinghamshire Regiment. So these were not just for sort of show. They were actually, they had exercises on their southern Maidan outside the court every Saturday and Monday. And when Dindals came, who is a military figure, military man, Governor General, that was the only unit which really impressed him, that these female mounted cavalry with the dexterity which they used their cavalry carbines. And there was also a lot of cross-dressing. I mean, you had women dressed in male military garb, prajuritam, Javanese military dress. And they were found on the battlefields during the Java War. Diponegoro had 2 or 3 female commanders who were the most feared of all his commanders because they were the most violent, and most cruel in many respects, and then, this is, for me, it comes from a past which is neglected by historians, which is that the Nusantara is part of a Polynesian world, a matriarchal world in which women have traditionally a very prominent role in the life of their communities. And indeed, in places like Minangkabau, the inheritance goes through the distaff, the female side, in families. So what is happening in Kuala Batu is not something unusual.
Exactly.
It's actually very much the norm in pre-colonial Southeast Asia. Obviously, then that was ironed out by two things. One was patriarchy, and the patriarchy of colonialism. There are no female governor generals, and there are no female colonial officers, as far as I know, until you know, Mary, what's her name, who wrote the book on Singapore, the great history of Singapore, Mary Rayner, and she got in by mistake, you know, in the early 1950s. Islamism, Muslim, you know, the formalism, which then begins to rule the roost. This is a Sufi Islamic world, and women have a very problem, and in political affairs.
Peter, just to add to what you've said, I think we have the same examples in mainland Southeast Asia as well. In Ayodhya, for example, you know, you had female palace guards and contingents of female soldiers and the palace as well. So I agree. You know, this is not new for us in Southeast Asia. It's new to the Americans. But my question is, why is it new to the Americans? Because you have the example of Native American communities where likewise you have women, you know, playing a far more prominent role compared to perhaps, you know, white American women in a mainstream American white Christian society. So that's why I find this surprising. I'm surprised that they're surprised, because if they had actually paid attention to the Native Americans that they're actually mowing down with the machine guns, you know, they would notice that actually this is not unique to Asia. There's nothing new about it. But again, I partly forgive the Americans at the time, because Southeast Asia was a new place. They're only beginning to come to Southeast Asia for the first time. And these are among the earliest writings by Americans about Southeast Asia. But the point is, I'm always surprised by their surprise, and I'm surprised by the fact that the comparison with Native Americans is also a very instrumental one that serves the ends of legitimation and justification of violence, but it's as if the Native Americans offer zero explanatory power to these American writers. It's as if, okay, you know, we'll use the Native Americans to justify why we shoot, but there's nothing we can learn from them, you know, and that for me is very telling as well.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Peter Carey, for the sharing. And let us go to Sultan Farish. Sultan Farish, you would like to ask a question?
Hello, yes, hello everyone, and it's a very good presentation. I'm from Aceh. It's basically from the area. I was born there, my mother was there, and my family was in the area, in Mangeng. Kuala Batu is the same thing. When I saw the poster, I was thinking Kuala Batu somewhere else, because there's no mention of Aceh. And it's like, so Kuala Batu, Sumatra, you know, it's like, and then when my friend sent the flyers, and I'm basically a study candidate PhD in Sheffield University for Acehnese women liberation. Is really, it's basically is a lot of in Aceh history is a lot of a woman become a leader is in the completely different with westernized kind of masculinity or feminist, but we was neglected. Like is everything have to be Western, you know, it's like the feminist is supposed to be from Western, you know, it's like, but from history we have king of women, we have like Salmana Malahayati as the Navy commander, you know, that's that kind of. And if you want to visit, is basically at the moment the local government trying to open the seaport where that event is happening between Kuala Batu and America. There's a big seaport there, and it was been closed for a long time. And Aceh Baradaya government trying to reopen it back, that seaport. And there's a lot of history. They found a lot of monument and all kind of. But it's hard to find the document because Aceh and Indonesia have a conflict. The all history document has been burned by Indonesian soldier, and but only a little bit left. But you can also access on the internet at the moment is acehbook.org.
Yeah.
You can access the information on there as well. But it's the same thing. I just basically wondered why in the beginning, like it always like Kuala Batu, Sumatra. You know, it's like it's supposed to be Kuala Batu is in Aceh. You know, it's like it's also because I'm from there. I feel like it's a bit confusing for me. And why it's not just at Kuala Batu, Aceh, Sumatra? You know.
No, it's a very simple answer, because at that time, Kuala Batu was a polity in its own right. It was a vassal.
Polity,
yeah. So it's not, I mean, we cannot impose on the past the political geography of today. And so in that sense, Kuala Batu, when the Americans interacted with Kuala Batu, they interacted with Kuala Batu as Kuala Batu. Not as a vassal of in fact, Aceh is almost mentioned by the Americans as a separate state. Which it was, because technically, you know, Aceh, the kingdom of Aceh, of course, is centered in where we now call Banda Aceh, and the Americans were interacting with the different coastal settlements along the northern coast of then. But they recognized Kuala Batu as a polity in its own right. And that's why the Americans referred to Kuala Batu as Kuala Batu. Equally interesting is how they spelled it, of course, Kuala with a Q, you know, like Kedah was spelled with a Q rather than a K. Right.
Oh, thank you. Saint?
Yes, thanks, Prof. Danny, for first of all inviting me to join this very interactive and interesting talk by Dr. Farish. And can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, very clear.
So first of all, I need to say it up front. I'm a fanboy of Dr. Farish. I've been following him since his Borders and Beyond series and all that. But on this particular topic, Dr. Farish, if you could, because I believe when you you deep dive into this event, as a historian, I'm not a historian to speak, but sometimes when we are doing research and all that, sometimes we have our limitation and all that. So in this event, I'm not sure what course that you use. If we are using mainly the newspapers from United States, the US, perhaps at that time in 1932, this is my perception, I believe the divided view was due to another event, perhaps, because there was like what was Dr. Farish rightly said at the beginning, there was this ongoing election. It was an election year. And at the same time, I believe there was also this war between Andrew Jackson and also the Bank of US and Nicholas Biddle, if I'm not mistaken. So there was this perception game that was going on at the back of the scene. So in terms of the when we are covering the bank war, especially, we got to know that Nicholas Biddle, he bankrolled some of the press, the newspaper. So sometimes these newspapers, they are political tools that will deliver the views of their masters and all that.
That's very clear. That's very clear.
Yeah. So when we are using that, because we have limitation, so we are using that particular sets of newspapers and all that. So how do we dissect to see actually what is happening? What happened? Is it actually what was portrayed in the newspaper? Is it true? Because like you know, I think that time the election year, they have two camps. So both the camps have their own newspaper companies and all that. So it's more of a political game, because like you said just now, the way Andrew Jackson and the Americans view on Native Americans is there. And here we are, and we are talking about how they were divided. They were emotional. They were showing some emotion to Asian natives and all that. So how do you balance that act when we are dealing with a certain event?
Okay, very simple. I hope none of us actually read newspapers for facts, yeah, because I've never done that in my life. For me, and again, Shahid, yeah, my background is not simply history. My actual background is actually philosophy and literature and discourse analysis. So the work I do looks at narratives. I take the narrative for what it is, yeah, because the narrative is something to be studied. And these narratives are telling in many ways. They tell us exactly what you're saying, that you have a divided America. And it's interesting to see how the divide in America is exacerbated by an event that takes place in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is instrumentalized. You take Southeast Asia, you put it in America, you bring this event to America to basically fight out American politics. Yeah. And there's nothing right or wrong about that per se. So I take it as it is. It's completely partisan. None of the newspapers were neutral or objective. And even the two books that came out give very divergent views. But there, we as historians can then reconstruct. We can reconstruct an account of the divisiveness of the American populace at the time and how Southeast Asia gets drawn into American history and American society and politics in a very instrumental way. This, in effect, means our history, Southeast Asian history, is linked to American history, which undergirds the claim I've always made that Southeast Asian history is world history. And this is not the only time. Events like this, the Franco-Siamese War, for instance, was hugely debated in the French press. By different sides that were very partisan, completely biased. Yeah, but it doesn't mean that we discount the news because it's biased. It's in fact the biasness of the news that I'm drawing upon to make my claim. And my claim is a simple one, that basically here's an instance where Southeast Asia gets dragged into American politics, and in the process of doing that, Southeast Asia becomes globalized. But this leads to another point. I'll be as quick as I can because it's already 4:30. I think we also need to understand that all these books written in the 19th century, yeah, newspapers and books as well. I mean, you need to be a bit, we need to understand what we're actually reading. I read Raffles' History of Java, 1817. I don't read Raffles' History of Java to learn about Java because I learn nothing about Java from Raffles. But what do I learn? I learn a lot about Raffles. I read the history of Java not to learn about Java because much of what's written in there is either distortion or magnified or amplified or distorted or fake or wrong. But I learn a lot about Raffles and I learn a lot about the East India Company. So how do we study the East India Company and the logic of what Syed Hussein Alatas called racialized colonial capitalism? It's by reading stuff like this. So what am I a historian of? I'm a historian of colonization. I want to understand how colonization works at a mental and discursive level. And that's why these books are hugely important to me. I don't seek the truth in them. I'm seeking an understanding of perceptions. I'm seeking, an understanding of interpretations and worldviews and perceptions. And that's what we find. We find a lot of it there. And so these things are still useful. It's just a question of, once we understand that we're not about to find objective truth, it's okay. Then you can do a historical textual analysis properly, without being dragged into, because, some of these distortions are completely false. But the falsity is important because that's how Orientalism is constructed. It requires these instrumental fictions, and that's what I do. I basically study the use of instrumental fictions in colonial politics. Yeah.
Thank you. Because of time, we have the last two questions. One is by Randy Ho.
Yeah.
Oh,
hi, Randy. Hello, Randy.
Hi, Professor. Good afternoon, and also good afternoon to Prof. Danny. Yeah, I just have one quick question to Prof. Farish regarding to your presentation, because like you mentioned about the extent of race and gender in the interpretations. So I just wonder if any like religious characteristic in these interpretations, because I just link like the religious characteristic, like for example, like when the Americans like, representing the Protestant view, and then towards the kampong, to the Sumatra, like represented by the Islam characteristic. Because it represents some of the contemporary, like in the current, when we said about the clash of civilization. So is there any like religious perspective in it?
Thank you, Randy. Very, very, very good question. I thought I didn't have time for that. I'll be as fast as I can. I mentioned earlier that among the two writers I look at, Jeremiah Reynolds and Francis Warner, Warner is the more pious one. He's actually a devout person. He didn't have many friends when he was on the Potomac because it's a military ship. And then he wanted to have a Bible reading group and he had no friends. Nobody wanted to join him. So he's a religious man. And this colors, his religious perception colors how he wrote about the event. For him, it was an unchristian thing to do. He's very strong on this, and so Francis Warner is very interesting because he's not a fighting man. He's a member of the crew. He might have been the chaplain on the ship. It's not very clear what his position was. He's not a sailor. He's not a marine, but he was aghast by the stealing and the killing of women that took place, and his sense of outrage is articulated in very religious terms. Now, Randy, you brought up a thing about Islam. Now, this is very important. It's Warner who was the only one who noted that among the things the Americans stole was the Quran from the ruler's house. And he said, this is obscene. You can't steal a Quran, And then the interesting thing is he noted that a few days later, members of that community, sailed to the ship and offered to buy back the Quran for $100 silver. And he writes this. And remember, he's not writing for Sumatrans. He's writing to his American readers. And he says, how, would a Christian offer $100 silver for a Quran? And yet these are Muslims who actually, came back to us and pleaded to have the Quran returned back to them. So that's actually very, very telling. It's actually a very interesting narrative between the two, between Reynolds and Warner. I find Warner more interesting because his devout religious beliefs are there. So that's the point, Randy. So religion does pop up, not in the newspaper reports. I've read many of the newspaper reports. It never pops up. They don't even mention that the people of Kuala Batu are Muslims, but Warner and Reynolds do. And for Warner, it's actually interesting, this juxtapositioning of again, on the one hand, martial Christianity, and on the other hand, the Muslim status of the victims or the ones who were attacked in Kuala Batu. So that's where it pops up. It pops up particularly in Warner's writing, and he uses it in a very interesting way, because he uses the Muslim identity of the Malays in a manner to admonish his fellow Christians and say, we talk about being, white American Christians, but look at them. They are more moral than us, for heaven's sakes. And he noted another interesting thing. He says that, even the bullets that the Sumatrans were using, they didn't use metal bullets. They used wooden bullets. They could have killed us, but they chose to use wooden bullets that were less harmful, whereas we used our cannons and our guns and we shot them at, and we burned down the fortresses while they were still inside. So it's actually interesting. Again, going back to Shahid's point, of course, again, Warner is taking sides. He's taking sides. He's making a moral judgment. Of course, it's judgmental, and obviously it therefore has to be biased. But it's interesting to see how that bias is constructed. So this is one instance where the Muslim identity of the Southeast Asians is actually presented in a positive way. It's a positive thing because the critique that Warner has is to his fellow American Christians instead. So thank you, Randy. That was a very important point.
Thank you, Prof.
We go to Dr. Shanti. Shanti, please. You need to unmute.
Much. Very lively and amazing storytelling skills, Prof. Farish. Enjoyed your history very much.
I know what to do when I retire then.
Storytelling, very skillful. Thank you very much. A very lively telling of the event. But I have an issue in terms of you linking only to the theory of race and not linking it to the theories related to gender in the region, Southeast Asia. So in terms of them seeing that men and women are about the same or look alike or behave alike has to do with the gender egalitarian values in the region at the particular time. And then the Native American Indians were also very, very gender egalitarian. We know that the Navajos are also matriarchal, like the Sumatrans, for example. So what we need to also do in terms of ending your theory in terms of the race hierarchy, they misconstrued the similarities they observed in gender roles to equating how men and women look alike, for example. The difference between the Southeast Asian gender egalitarianism being noticed by, the Americans and the gender egalitarianism being noticed in the American context is that in the American context, they don't belong to a world religion. They are, natives without a religion, but they do have a belief system, but unfortunately was not recognized. And therefore, the Native American Indians, there was a major attempt to harvest their souls, to missionaries and Jesuits were out there trying to Christianize the Native American Indians. But in Southeast Asia, because they belong to a world religion, there was a bit of a respect, the incident where the Quran was seen as being so valuable that they wanted that back is a very interesting view. Although it's gender egalitarian, the women and men are alike, but then they have a world religion. But in terms of the Native American Indians, there was gender egalitarianism, but they say they're egalitarian, but then, But I think in terms of trying to tie it to the race theories, in terms of the similarities that was observed between men and women, physiologically and physically, but also in terms of gender roles, there was quite a lot of similarities. They saw more women out in trading and farming and so on. So therefore, they can't accept from very patriarchal cultures, very difficult for them to accept that women were doing the work that men should do. And Peter Jackson also mentioned they were in the army, they were defending men and things like that. It was very strange for them.
Yeah.
So I think that's my view, and thank you very much again. Enjoyed Saturday afternoon.
Thank you. And that's why I think that image that I showed earlier, the painting by Carter Beard, that painting in itself is amazing, because here you have, if you look at that painting, if you recall, I'll share it again. Give me 1 second. Or for some reason I can't share. But anyway, in that painting, I hope you recall the painting. Anyone looking at that painting would see the American as the bad guy. He's the aggressor. He's with the gun and the point and the bayonet, and the woman is the hero. She's the hero. She's actually holding on to the bayonet, preventing him from killing, the Sumatran man. So I find this interesting too. Though having said that, if I may respond there, in the 2 books in particular, the observations that are made are more on physiology, i.e. they physically look alike. Although both Warriner and Reynolds and later American writers, who come to Southeast Asia, people like Bickmore, people like Taylor, people like other writers who come later, all observe that Southeast Asian women are active, particularly in commerce, because they land at ports, and what do they see at ports? They see women merchants, right? Somehow this is mentioned in passing, and I wonder why it's mentioned in passing, because it's something that surely would have been the most striking observation for an American to make at the time. That's one, and I can't account for this. What they seem to be focusing on is literally the facial features and how a Javanese man and a Javanese woman actually look alike, because the Javanese man doesn't look like a Victorian man with a flowing beard and doesn't look like Charles Darwin, basically. And I think this is an interesting thing, because that's where the timeliness of this comes in. This theory is a very 18th, 19th century theory, and it's really locates this event squarely in the middle of the rise of empire in the 19th century. However, there's one thing, if I may add, but before I end, I've always been curious, how did American women react to this? Because I've been looking and looking and looking and looking for perhaps an American female columnist who might have written about it, or a letter written to the press by an American woman. I've not found any, unfortunately. And we know that much later on, and from the second half of the 19th century, we start having people like Anna Leon Owens or Isabella Bird coming to Southeast Asia, but they're not exactly, feminists themselves. In fact, they're actually, all, very much supporters of patriarchal imperialism. But I would be interested, to find perhaps a reaction to this event, because for at least a couple of years, this was widely discussed in American newspapers. I would be very interested to know how white American women reacted to this, but thus far, unfortunately, I've not found any. And so I can't answer that question, but I agree with the observation that you made.
Thanks, Farish. Last one, Catherine.
Catherine, you're muted.
Unmute, yes. Okay.
All right. Okay.
No. Yes, unmuted.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yes, I think you would probably, if you're looking for perspectives of white American women, I think you would be very excited to read Paths of Duty by Patricia Grimshaw. And she talks about missionary women from New England in Hawaii and how they tried to recreate Hawaiians in their own image and undermined autonomy that Hawaiian women had. I think you'd love it.
Yeah, and there's also been work on the American teachers, female teachers who went to the Philippines, of course, a whole, literally that famous cartoon in Puck magazine where, we have shown you how our sons fight, and now we will show you how our daughters teach. And then these American soldiers leave, and a whole army of female American teachers come to quote unquote educate the Filipinos. So you have that, missionary zeal there, but you see that also in Anna Leon Owens. Yeah, I mean, when she says that, this is why we need empire in Siam, because we are here to liberate these women. So there's a lot of shades of George Bush and Operation Enduring Freedom, and that sort of stuff in the background. But I'm more interested to see whether there were actually American women who agreed with the criticism of the attack, or American women who say, look, how come their women get to be merchants and soldiers, and how come their women get to carry swords and guns, and we are told to stay at home and crochet instead, and stuff like that. So I've always wondered, because this was, like I said, something hotly discussed for a couple of years at least, but I'm not sure, I don't know to what extent it actually had an impact beyond these newspapers. Within this domain of newspapers and the world of letters, it's still largely a white male Protestant upper class domain. And all of these people, Warriner and Reynolds and Commodore Downs and all that, they're basically part of the upper crust of American society at the time. I'm just wondering aloud whether this debate actually trickled down or moved beyond that domain into other domains. And so far, unfortunately, I've not been able to find anything yet.
Well, thank you, Farish, and thank you everyone for those very interesting questions and comments. I'm afraid we can't go on because time is, it's time's up. So I think all of us, I think all of you will agree with me that we all have a wonderful afternoon. It's a time well spent.
I hope so.
We want to thank all of you for coming to this, online for this talk. For those of you who have written some comments on the on the chat box. Unfortunately, we can't deal with them one by one. So, but nonetheless, we want to ask all of you to actually thank Farish, Professor Farish Noor for
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you once again for coming. And we will keep you posted on the future talks and activities of the MBRAS. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Goodbye.